All right, welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to do a reaction to something I promised a little bit ago. We covered this, the 90s reign, a little while back, and I wanted to hit up this one right here. So it's another scat video, and it's called Kobe Owned the 2000s, and it wasn't close. After this, we're going to do this guy right here. We're going to cover the 80s. But let's go ahead and get right into this one.
The GOAT, greatest player of all time. A debate which has been percolating around various NBA hot stoves for the better part of 60 years. And generally, the individuals who owned each NBA era, broken down by decade, beginning in the 1960s and running all the way until today, are the players most commonly found in these top 10 conversations and GOAT debates. But starting in the 1960s and running all the way to the 90s, all of those eras were and are subject to some kind of debate. It wasn't until the 90s where a player singularly owned an era, with Jordan leading the league in scoring and winning a championship in all 6 years that he played in during the decade. But
Agreed 100%. I mean, we know we're going to cover the 80s now, so that's Magic and Bird. 90s was all MJ, man. After that, what we're going to cover today is the 2000s. And it's going to be interesting because I mean, there's a lot of Kobe in there. There's a lot of Shaq in there. And then, you know, you got a lot of Spurs in there. So this should be an interesting video.
following his three-peat repeat at the end of the 97-98 season, the NBA was left in a state of limbo, waiting for the next great player to take over. And in those last 2 years of the 90s, two bigs would surface and use those final 2 seasons as a springboard to audition and set the stage for their claim as the GOAT of the following decade of the 2000s. It was a strike-shortened 50-game season in the 1998-99 league year when 22-year-old Tim Duncan would lead the San Antonio Spurs to the best record in the NBA and what would be his first of 5 eventual NBA championships. The following season in 1999-2000, Shaquille O'Neal would win league MVP while leading the league in scoring and winning the NBA championship. And
dude, he got so much more thick the second he went to the Lakers. Like, I mean, if you could have just stayed right here and kept working on his dribbling, can you imagine how dominant he would have been? He just had to go and gain like another 50 pounds of fat. Slowed his ass down later on.
And the following decade of the 2000s would then present a case for seemingly 3 or even 4 different players in what many present as the greatest coin toss era of them all, with O'Neal dominating the early portion of the decade, producing averages of 21 points, 10 rebounds, and 2 blocks per game for the 10-year span of the 2000s, while being named to 8 All-Star games and making an All-NBA first team 6 times.
I gotta look at that again.
While being named to 1 points, 10
All right. As impressive as this is, I feel like he should be getting more rebounds. You know? I'm not dissing Shaq. I'm just saying, where were those rebounds? Because in his prime, he was easily getting 15 rebounds a game. So he definitely took some nights off.
Rebounds and 2 blocks per game for the 10-year span of the 2000s, while being named to 8 All-Star games and making an All-NBA first team 6 times during the decade. He would add an additional All-NBA third-team selection during this decade, as well as 2 All-NBA defensive second-team honors. All of the individual accolades en route to 3 championships during the 2000s. 2 at the front end of the decade with the Los Angeles Lakers, and 1 in the middle part of the decade with the Miami Heat. And as great as Shaquille O'Neal was during this decade, his reign tapered off in the second half, while the 22-year-old that won the first post-Jordan era title in the 98-99 season was only getting started. And Tim Duncan would grow into not just arguably the best player of the 2000s during this decade, but would become one of the best players of all time, as he is generally credited with being the best power forward in NBA history. And when evaluating
I mean, that's a good argument. If it's not him, who is it? Power forward? We did small forward, and the majority of the comments agree. Larry Bird. But who's the greatest power forward of all time, if not Tim Duncan? Charles Barkley would have been on the list if he would have won some rings, but Timmy's got it all.
Evaluating his play during this decade, it was easy to see why. During this decade of the 2000s, Tim Duncan averaged 21 points, 11.5 rebounds, and 2.3 blocks per game, while being named to an
If he's pulling in more rebounds than Shaq did, that's interesting to me. That means he worked harder.
All-Star team every season and being named to a first-team All-NBA distinction 6 times with 3 second-team honors and 1 third-team, rounding out the decade with an All-NBA team selection for all 10 years. He also made 6 All-NBA defensive first teams during this decade, while being named second-team defense 4 times, thus making an All-NBA defensive team all 10 years of this decade as well. Therefore, Duncan was the best player at his position on both sides of the floor for a decade where he won 3 NBA championships along the way, making him an easy candidate for the best player of this or any decade. He was so great that he overshadowed other elite all-time players throughout this decade, such as Dirk Nowitzki, who averaged 24.5 points per game, 9 rebounds, and 3 assists per game for the 2000s.
Not only 3 assists. That I wasn't expecting.
Averaging more points than either Duncan or Shaq, while scoring more total points for the decade than either of them, substantially more. Nowitzki would also be named an All-Star 9 times during this decade, while being named All-NBA first or second team 8 times in the 10-year span. While Dirk would ultimately capture his one and only NBA championship, which is one of the very best titles in NBA history, that wouldn't ultimately come until the next decade. Along with Duncan and Dirk, the decade of the 2000s.
Dude, Dirk is one of the most clumsy, just weird. I've never seen a player just look so clunky and clumsy. But the dude knew what he was doing. He was precise with his clumsiness. I figured it out after watching him for a year or two. I was like, this shit's intentional. And it's effective too.
Would yield yet a
It's like a drunken what is it? Like drunken kung fu? It reminds me of that, where it's like you think this is not really like a master, it's just some drunken old man, but just sipping on his freaking wine and fighting. But this shit's intentional and he's gonna whoop your ass.
Another historical all-time great power forward, also in the loaded Western Conference,
KG was a beast.
As Kevin Garnett would rise to prominence during the 2000s, being named an All-Star every year of this decade and averaging 21 points, 12 rebounds, and 4.5 assists a night, while being named to...
See, it's another power forward that got more rebounds than Shaq. Just saying. It's interesting how this works.
An All-NBA team 7 times for the 10-year span, along with All-NBA defensive honors 9 times for the decade. Also along the way of this decade, a new crop of NBA talent would come along in the 2003 draft. A legendarily stacked draft class, rivaling the 96 class and the 1984 class for the best draft ever. In this one, LeBron James, Carmelo Anthony, Chris Bosh, and Dwayne Wade would come off the board in 4 of the first 5 picks. While none of them have a valid claim on this decade, all of them would make immediate impacts during the 2000s, most notably Dwayne Wade and LeBron James, with Wade averaging...
Hey man, Chris Bosh was a beast when he played in Toronto. It wasn't until he joined LeBron in Miami that he was just like an average player at that point.
25.5 points per game, 5 rebounds, 6.5 assists, and nearly 2 steals per game for the 7 seasons he played in the decade.
I gotta look at that again real quick. Sorry.
5 rebounds.
That surprises me. Only 5 rebounds, D-Wade, huh?
6.5 assists, and nearly 2 steals per game for the 7 seasons he played in the decade, while winning a championship in the 2005-2006 season and claiming Finals MVP that year.
Yeah,
LeBron, meanwhile, would average
nearly
28 points per game, 7 rebounds, and 7 assists, while being named All-NBA first or second team 6 of his 7 seasons played during the 2000s. But he wouldn't be able to parlay any of that individual success into winning until joining the other elite newbie that came in the 2003 draft class.
Yeah, LeBron had the stats, but D-Wade had the clutch.
Oh, and one other guy from the top part of that class. That, however, wouldn't be until the following decade of the 2010s. But what if I were to tell you that despite all of the greatness displayed during this decade, one player dominated the 2000s more thoroughly than any player in any other decade in league history?
Did Kobe get all 5 of his championships in the 2000s? I mean, 2000 and 2010, that is? Because I think he did, huh? They got Powell by then, right? 2007, 2008, something like that?
Aside from the 90s.
What?
Yes, it's true. And it was not any of the aforementioned players. While it's true, the decade from the 2000-2001 season and running through the 2010 league year is one that would be presented as a toss-up by revisionists in the biased media and teenagers on social media, in reality, Kobe Bryant dominated this decade more thoroughly than any player in league history aside from Jordan's 90s. In this 10-year span, Kobe led the league in both scoring average and total points scored. One of only 3 players in league history to do so, joining Chamberlain from the 60s and Kareem from the 70s. His 28.5 points per game during this decade is the 5th highest average ever in league history, behind only Wilt Chamberlain and Oscar Robertson's averages in the 60s and Michael Jordan's averages in the 80s and 90s.
Okay. So we're talking eras. So in the 60s, Wilt had 34 points a game. Just stupid, ridiculous. 30, that's right at his career average, 30.3. Oscar at 20. Damn, man. Oscar at 29 in the 60s. Kobe was right there. You know, it's similar to a lot of things that Kobe did in his career, which is like right there, right next to MJ's, just slightly below. When it comes to his championship, he had one less. His points were slightly less, except for the totals, but the averages were. Then same thing if you broke down like defensive stats, like steals, blocks, all that. It's just like so freaking close to Jordan. It was just, I mean, he was like Jordan, but 10% less, basically.
While Kobe's 21,550 total points scored in this 10-year span is the 4th most ever, trailing only Kareem's 1970s total by a mere 264 total points for 3rd place, and behind Wilt and Oscar Robertson's monstrous decade of the 1960s. But while Wilt and Oscar played in the turbocharged pacing of the 1960s, which was the highest scoring decade in NBA history, where nightly league-wide scoring averages were 115.
Hey, that's interesting, because I talk about this a lot and the difference of what that's making in current scoring. So the 60s were just ridiculous. That was the worst time as far as defense goes. It just wasn't happening. 70s, still high. 80s were actually higher than I thought they were. So it wasn't until the 90s when Jordan dominated. Scoring went down to 101, and then it went down even more. And I believe this is around the time where they brought in the 3-point line to be college regulated, you know, the college regulated line instead to increase scoring. But now we're up 12.5 points from that 90s era. So Kobe's points actually, wow, I got to admit it, Kobe's points actually went the furthest. Even further than Jordan's. Slightly, but further. So when he averaged 35 a year, I mean, that's right there with Jordan's 37. I gotta fucking admit it. Go Kobe.
Points per game. The decade from 2000 through 2010 that Kobe was in his prime during was the slowest paced, lowest scoring decade ever by far, with nightly scoring averages for his 10-year span at only 96.9 points per game, nearly 20 points per game less than the 1960s. The 2000s were also significantly lower than the 108.3 point per game average.
I just got to say, so in this era, Kobe Bryant had 81-point game. How freaking crazy is that? You know, when the average is 97, like what the hell did he pull off that game?
1960s. The 2000s were also significantly lower than the 108.3 point per game average Kareem enjoyed in the 1970s, and even substantially lower than the scoring and pace of play in Jordan's decade of the 80s and yes, even the 90s. Factoring in pace of play and scoring rate, one can easily make the argument Kobe Bryant had the greatest scoring decade in NBA history during the 2000s, the most lethal scoring weapon in that decade, and arguably the best ever. And in that decade, Kobe also made 9 All-NBA defensive teams of that 10-year span, with 7 of those being first-team selections. This is while being named an All-Star and to an All-NBA team for all 10 years, 8 of which were first-team distinction. So like Duncan during this decade, Kobe was easily the best player at his position on both sides of the ball. But Kobe did this while leading the decade in points scored and scoring average, while scoring over 5,000 more points for the decade than Tim Duncan. And during the decade, Kobe...
Yeah, but to be fair, Duncan filled up the other stats a little more. You know, Kobe's still my guy in that era, but, you know, Duncan did more rebounds and yada, yada.
He went to 6 NBA Finals series, more than anyone else, and won 4 championships during this 10-year span, also more than anyone else for the decade. And that was with Kobe going through a full-blown rebuild in the middle part of the decade and wasting 2 full seasons with dreadful supporting casts, which eventually would result in one of, if not the greatest playoff runs in NBA history to end this decade, taking at the time his one-time All-Star in Pau Gasol and running through a playoff gauntlet never before seen and never seen since to make 3 consecutive finals appearances, winning back-to-back titles.
The reason I think, you know, Jordan and Kobe were different than LeBron, one of the many reasons, is you got a guy like Pau Gasol, right? Player. But he played his best when he was with Kobe. Like, by far. Before and after his tenure with Kobe, you know, he was just a good player, like a really good player. But, I mean, he was freaking amazing when he played there. Now, you can say the same thing with pretty much everybody Jordan played with. And, yeah, they had their best years with MJ. Now you switch over to LeBron, and I have the exact opposite argument. Players like D Wade, Chris Bosh, Kevin Love, freaking recently Russ, you know, like the list goes on, honestly. All those players, they played their worst when they were with LeBron. So what is it? You know, what is it with LeBron and his system that's just like ruining these players' potentials? I don't know. But MJ and Kobe sure brought it out of players, you know, guys like a Luke Longley or, you know, a Bill Wennington or something like that. Like they were, I'm sorry to say, they were nobody, but they were champions with MJ.
Titles. In his 3-year finals run from 2007 through 2010, 11 of Bryant's 12 playoff opponents won at least 50 games during the regular season. Kobe would also lead the NBA playoffs in scoring for all 3 of those seasons, a feat accomplished by only one other player in modern NBA history, and that, of course, was you-know-who. Kobe, meanwhile, would also lead the Lakers in assists and steals over the 3-year finals run spanning
I didn't know
67
about the
games in the
assist.
postseason while averaging 30 points per game, right in the heart of the aforementioned slowest paced, lowest scoring decade ever. And yet, people actually say this decade is a toss-up, or even more pathetic, try painting it as Duncan's decade, when in reality, no one destroyed his era more thoroughly from a collective, individual, and team success standpoint than Kobe Bryant, other than Michael Jordan. Which is why so many players and those of us who actually watched this era have Kobe Bryant ranked so highly on those all-time lists. And while that does conclude our look at the 2000s, please make sure to subscribe and tune in for the next and final episode of The GOAT by Decades, when we take a look at the super team stacking decade of the 2010s.
Oh,
Until
no.
next time.
Oh, no. We're going to have to watch that too, aren't we? Well, all right, everybody. Thanks for watching the video. That was pretty entertaining. I was expecting a little more to go to Tim Duncan and the Spurs, but I think he did it justly because 4 out of those years belonged to Kobe. I thought it was 5, but he must have got that fifth ring in what, 2011? Help me out in the comments. So, what do you guys think? I was already leaning towards Kobe dominated that era, but not like pure domination like Jordan did in the 90s. Like I felt like it was him mainly dominating and then the Spurs kind of being that number two. What do you guys think? Hit it up in the comments as always. And thanks for watching. Shoot me a like and subscribe, and let's fight it out in the comments, or at least have a cool conversation. And as always, check out Scap. I will link this video in the description down below, as always. And see you guys in the next one. Peace out.